Hello, thanks for tuning in. My name's Stuart. I'm the classical record collector. Today I'm going to be reviewing the label Decca Eclipse. Now specifically I'm going to be reviewing the electronically reprocessed mono recordings for stereo. So Eclipse appeared I think in the late 60s, early 70s, and it was intended as a kind of mid-price reissue label. So there are genuine stereo recordings available on Eclipse, which mainly come from the SXL 2000 series, but there are many more recordings issued from the LXTs, the monos, which came out in the 50s on Decca, and which predominantly did not have an equivalent SXL, in other words, a stereo. So I mean, some of the early monos that Decca did, they also did a stereo, but they didn't release the stereo. They just released the mono. But in terms of, obviously, if they had the stereo, then they would release the stereo on Eclipse, more or less. I think there are one or two exceptions to this, maybe because the stereo wasn't so successful. But by and large, they used Eclipse really for releasing a lot of mono material. Now, I think there's nothing wrong with this because, let's face it, if you collect classical records, you'll know that a lot of those Deccas, the Decca 5000 series with the gold letters on orange, or even the silver letters before the grooved label started appearing, the quality of those generally is so poor, it's very difficult to find a nice clean copy of an original old Decca mono record. So I would think it would be a good thing that Decca released a lot of these mono recordings onto a late 60s, early 70s superior pressing. Except that at the time I thought the silly fools have actually reprocessed the mono recording to give a stereo effect. Now let's just have a look at some examples. We've got here Vivaldi, we've got the Four Seasons with Munchinger, and we've got Reinhold Barchet playing, the excellent violinist. And here we've got the record. Now on the back of the jacket, it actually says, I don't know whether you can see this, you probably can't. Yeah, but I'll read it out. It says, mono recording electronically reprocessed to give stereo effect on stereo equipment. This record can be played on a mono reproducers, providing either a compatible or stereo cartridge wired for mono is fitted. Okay, so there's also this thing where there's a hole provided, and those of you who collect Deccas are familiar with this. You put the jacket in, there's a hole up here, you can see it, I'm just pointing it with my index finger, and if that's blue it means stereo, yeah, and if it's red it means mono, you know, which means that some were actually released as ECMs, some LXTs must have been released as pure mono and not reprocessed for stereo. So that's interesting. But this one says blue stereo, but it's fake stereo. And if you look on the label, take the record out and we look on the label, it says here right in the middle of the label, just above the spindle hole, mono recordings electronically reprocessed to give stereo effect on stereo equipment. Now, if it doesn't say that on your record, and it's an ECS, it means it's true stereo. So I'll hold that up. I don't know whether you can see that and whether it's readable. Maybe it is. If you look above the spindle, it says electronically reprocessed. Yeah. So I've got 3 records, but before we do that, before we listen to them, I'm going to play half a minute from each one. I know it's not ideal because, you know, I've recorded these through my headphone socket on my amplifier, using a long cable into my computer, but you know, at least it will give you some idea of what they sound like. I've recorded them in stereo, of course, but before we do that, I had a look on a forum called audioasylum.com, and there's some information from a Decca engineer about how they actually did this fake stereo. So let me just read that out. At Decca we developed a 3-track system in which the mono original was copied as 2 mono tracks to a stereo 1/4-inch tape recorder. The original mono source was brought to the mixing console as a center signal, and 2 additional tracks were brought back out of phase carefully level matched so that they cancelled when panned center. These tracks were then panned left and right. The 2-track recorder had a vari-speed control by which one could control the delay between mono original and the 2-track machine. By setting the mono source to say -3 decibels ref peak level, panned center, and adding the left and right channels out of phase at say 12 to 15 decibels below, one achieved quite a realistic concert hall effect, but of course without spot information. Okay, well that's interesting. I have to say I don't fully understand there what actually was done. I kind of understand it, but some of the terminology there I'm not au fait with. Maybe some of you guys understand and you could sort of shed a bit more light, but as far as I can see, they used obviously the original mono on two tracks, and they played around with the levels, and they mastered them slightly out of phase. I'm not sure exactly what that means, but I actually, on Audacity, because I use Audacity to digitize, I've got a screenshot here. I'm going to show it now. And as you can see, there are the 2 tracks. And you can see that one track is slightly louder than the other. You can see that's obvious. But both tracks fairly closely resemble each other. You know, there are some differences, but it looks to me like one track is louder than the other, basically. And there are some differences there, so I don't know if that tells you anything, but on a true well, of course, on stereo you would expect you would expect the 2 tracks to be significantly different, but on this fake stereo they look very similar, except one is at a slightly higher level than the other. Well, I don't know if that tells you anything, but anyway, we're going to listen first to the Munchinger Vivaldi. From the second side, Autumn. We're going to listen to some of the first movement where the violin comes in so you can hear the solo. So that lasts 51 seconds, and I'm going to play that now. Okay, well there we go. So that was Reinhold Barchet playing. You know something? I never used to listen to these fake stereos, and to be honest with you, I actually find that quite reasonable. I find it fairly good quality. I did listen, of course, on the 2 speakers. I sat right in between my own 2 speakers. There is a bit of an effect. It's quite sort of subtle, but you can't really place and pick out the instruments. There is a bit of a concert hall effect, but it's nothing like, of course, true stereo. Anyway, so for the next one, we're going to listen to Rachmaninoff. This is from an LXT with Adrian Bolt conducting, and it's Rhapsody on a Theme of Paganini, Julius Katchen, who I think recorded these in stereo as well. But this is from the early LXT. So yeah, let's have a listen to that. Starting, let me just get my watch out. Okay, go now. Okay, so that was Rachmaninoff, and I thought that sounded very good too. Now, I tend to listen when I'm working, and I'm sat in between the speakers, but at the side. So, I mean, it sounds kind of like mono, but it sounds nice and clear. The instruments sound good and everything. It projects very well. It sounds nice. I'd rather listen to one of these than an LXT. So let's have a listen to the third one. It's Bolero, and I've dropped the needle around the end of the track so you can hear the finale playing out. I just thought that might be interesting anyway. So let's go with Bolero now. Okay, so that's Bolero. Dramatic ending there. Music famous in its own right. Of course, Torvill and Dean, the skating champions, helped to make Bolero even more famous than it already is. So yeah, that's three that have come from, I think, LXTs where there's no stereo available. And the good thing about the ECS, the Eclipse, is that the pressings are quite good. So they're going to be much better than you would have. If I had a mono switch on my amplifier, I would throw the mono switch and just listen in mono to cancel out. Somebody did comment on a forum that they compared it with the LXT and they played it in mono, and it sounded more or less exactly the same. But I would imagine that it sounded better than the LXT just simply because, LXTs are like early and mid 50s, late 50s maybe, and the Eclipse series was more or less early 70s when the Decca pressings were quite good, really. Quite silent pressings and good dynamic range. Yeah, so don't be afraid at all. If you see these around in charity shops or wherever for £1 each or 50 pence, I would recommend buying them because, to listen to some of these old performances, I think it's better to listen on a Decca Eclipse than an early LXT, unless it's in absolutely pristine condition, in which case, of course, it would be. Okay, well, that concludes my review of Decca Eclipse. If any of you got any comments at all to add below the video, please, I'll be happy to read and indeed reply to your comments. Thank you very much, and hope you enjoyed it. Goodbye.